You know, the best part about caving is that you actually don't have to do it. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Loreline. Pale skin, dark sunken eyes, elongated faces, sharp teeth, and the like. These images inspire horror and revulsion in many, and with good reason. The characteristics shared by these faces are imprinted in the human mind. The question you have to ask yourself is this: what happened deep in the hidden eras before history began that could affect the human race so evenly as to give the entire species a deep, instinctual, and lasting fear of pale beings with dark, sunken eyes, razor-sharp teeth, and elongated faces? If there is one piece of literature that has affected my interest in the paranormal, the preternatural, or the general unknown more than any other, it is the unabridged version of what I just read to you. It's not because genetic memory, as it's commonly known, is the best written or most descriptive horror story of all time. It doesn't make you think to check every shadow the way that many stories about ghosts, demons, or other supernatural evils do. It doesn't make you jump every time a stair creaks or something knocks inside of a wall. No, the reason this story has been so present in my mind for the last 15-odd years is because it asks a question that cuts to one of the core aspects of our humanity. This strange phenomenon of passing the psychological effects of our experiences from generation to generation through the most basic building block of what we are, that being our DNA. As the complete version of the story, which isn't all that much longer, notes, our fear of certain characteristics seems to be present from birth. If you show an infant an image of one of the crawlers from The Descent, chances are the child is not going to react positively. Even as we grow up and mature into adulthood, the discomfort with translucent flesh, pale-colored eyes, and mouths full of pointed teeth never really leaves us. And to many, this is known as the uncanny valley effect, but I think there's a simpler way of describing it: primal fear. For some reason, we all come into this world with a hardwired aversion to a very specific set of features, no matter which part of the planet we're from, and no matter what cultural memories we carry with us. But why? The author of Genetic Memory posits, more sincerely than I think most creepypasta authors do, that something traumatized early humans so immensely that it left an indelible mark on the psyche of our entire species. And I, for one, don't think that's particularly ridiculous. After all, the horror movie industry has been churning out material largely based around those same fears for over a century now. And while I wouldn't consider myself an expert in the genre, I think most horror enthusiasts would agree that the 1922 version of Nosferatu qualifies as one of the first true horror movies. And the vampiric antagonist in that film is a near-perfect match with the description given in Genetic Memory. In most cases, though, cinematic expressions of that archetype are focused on the supernatural. But not in all of them. See, there's a reason I mentioned the monsters from The Descent as an example of this sort of fear. Where so many other horror films utilize definitively supernatural elements, Neil Marshall's 2005 masterpiece forces the viewer to confront something much more tangible: a divergent line of hominids which entered the cave systems beneath America's eastern mountain ranges sometime in the distant past, and then never came out. In other words, something which could, without invoking the paranormal, exist. Moreover, The Descent takes place in an area of the United States which is home to a long-existing legend about such creatures, a series of unsolved disappearances, and mountains so old they predate the trees which now blanket their mist-covered slopes. If there were one place on Earth where you might find the last remnant of whatever inspired our species-wide fear of pale-skinned, milky-eyed, fang-toothed humanoids, would it not be the myriad unmapped cave systems which lay beneath the Appalachian Mountains? Furthermore, could it be the descendants of those very same ancient humans who are responsible for some, though most certainly not all, of the unsolved disappearances in those ancient hills? In today's video, we're going to take a look at folklore, history, and missing persons cases, with a special look into the biological realities which could make the existence of our feral genetic cousins possible, provided by our friend Jacob over at Roanoke Gaming. And maybe, just maybe, we'll be able to answer that question of our genetic memory. But one other question that we must ask ourselves is Am I getting the most out of my athletic clothes? The best way to have a confident answer to that question is through today's sponsor, Fabletics. In 2014, Fabletics set out to revolutionize the athletic wear industry by combining the pinnacle of form and function, blending a unique fashion sense with an obsession for quality, to create the ultimate luxury athletic wear, like, what I'm currently wearing, which I gotta say is incredibly comfortable, lightweight, and breathable, while also having a design that somehow fits the channel's vibe. Oh, and just for the record, this is a different thing entirely. I know I'm dressed like an athlete, but I just am old. I did a pull-up and I yoinked something in my elbow. This, however, like I said, is from Fabletics, as are several other things sitting out there that I am very excited to wear in the future. And that is because Fabletics doesn't just do gym clothes. Fabletics instead provides a wide range of optimized clothing for both men and women. My fiance was very excited about this ad slot, with soft but durable high-performance materials featuring bold prints and colors, and all at an affordable price point. The moisture-wicking, quick-dry material features internal and external pockets to provide a flexible but supportive base for all of your active needs. And with our exclusive link, you can get access to the VIP intro offer, which includes up to 80% off your first order when you sign up to become a new Fabletics VIP. This also includes an optional member credit if you wish to shop for a given month, allowing your VIP payment to unlock a bundle kit or any item up to $100. So, if you'd like to give Fabletics a try and become a VIP member, check out our link in the description below. Partially because it provides a good baseline for the concept, and partially because it's October, it's probably a good idea to go over the basic premise of The Descent and the invented lore behind its primary antagonists before we get into the potentially real creepy-crawly humans in the caves that we're going to be talking about today. That said, if you're not really interested in the horror movie aspect and just want to skip ahead to the unexpected and, in fact, unplanned tie-ins with Cherokee folklore, and from there the unsolved disappearances within the area, you can skip ahead to the next chapter. We'll also have a segment about the making of the movie The Descent at the end of the episode, hosted by my producer, NYU Film School graduate Aidan Thornbury. Hi. There we go. For those unfamiliar with the story, however, it is hands down one of the best written narrative pieces in the horror genre, at least in my humble opinion, and also one of the most realistic. The story begins in earnest when Sarah, a young Scottish woman trying to move on a year after the tragic deaths of her husband and daughter, heads to the United States to go on a spelunking trip with her very adventurous group of girlfriends. Her friend Juno, an American, plans on leading the group of 6 through the fictional Bourne or Borum Caverns in the equally fictional Chattooga National Park, which itself is set in the non-fictional Appalachian section of North Carolina. I won't go too deep into the details of the plot which don't pertain to the concept of divergent hominids, because we'll do that on our live show for October 13th, 2025, but there are a few important points to note given the question of, could these things be real? The most significant would be the little wrinkle of Juno lying about what system they were actually going to be exploring. After a cave-in leaves the group unable to return via the same route they followed in, another of the girls, Rebecca, pulls out the guidebook to see if there are any other ways out. And seeing that there are at least 2, she suggests that they try them, only for Juno to reveal that they are not, in fact, in Bourne Caverns, but rather an unmapped cave she thought it might be fun for all of them to explore. And this is a problem for a few reasons, not the least of them being that any attempted rescue would never know where to find them. Remember, everyone, stay on the marked trail, and if you absolutely must go off the marked trail, make sure that somebody knows precisely what route you intend to take and when you expect to be back. Also, don't go wandering aimlessly through unmapped caves. That's how you end up like John Jones in Nutty Putty Cave. Anyway, the other significant aspect of this is how it factors into the question of divergent hominids living amongst us, because if they were going to remain undiscovered for this long, an unmarked cave is just about the only place that they could possibly manage to pull that off. That said, there are countless unmapped and undiscovered caves in the Appalachian Range, and the ones that we do know of can get very, very long. Mammoth Cave, for example, is not only the longest in the Appalachians, but the longest in the world at over 426 miles, and we keep finding more of it. Not only that, but many of these caves connect to one another, meaning that there is potential for underground networks spanning dozens to hundreds of miles throughout the mountains. It's not ridiculous to say that small populations of people could inhabit some of the undiscovered ones. And considering how little time we actually spend in those tunnels, and how many of them are connected to one another, it may not even be out of the question that they might travel through the mapped ones either. Yeah, so consider that when you go caving next time. You know, maybe one of you is going to be the reason that Ted the Caver becomes a documentary. And then I'm going to make that documentary. But I'd prefer not to make that documentary. And especially not about one of you. But if I do have to make that documentary, it will be great, trust me. And while most of what I just said is a joke, that actually is the direction that The Descent takes the story. Not long after the collapse that leaves these girls trapped, they come across a set of century-old climbing equipment, as well as what appear to be Neolithic or Paleolithic-era paintings depicting two entrances to the system. Later on, Juno will discover other markings from the team which explored the cave 100 years earlier, but not before something goes terribly wrong. Just when everyone thinks they're safe, Holly, an Irish lass, sees what she thinks is daylight ahead of them, but as she runs towards it, she slips, falls into a hole, and then plummets deeper into the cave. Now, miraculously, the rest of the girls find her alive, but with a compound fracture in her tibia. And to add insult to literal injury, it wasn't sunlight she saw, just phosphorescent rock. And of course, because this is a horror movie and things can always get worse, as they all work on that problem, Sarah, again the main character, does some exploring and comes across their actual problem for the first time. A humanoid creature with translucent skin, milky white eyes, fanged teeth, and a sharp jawline. It's also rather slimy, and they find out that it's not alone very soon after this. Now, the crew spends the rest of the film running, fighting, and of course dying, with Sarah being the only survivor by the time she eventually crawls to the surface through another exit, and then she somehow finds her way through the Appalachian forest back to the car, despite having no clue where the entrance was in relation to where she came out, which is arguably the least believable part of the entire film. But anyway, she hops into her car and then drives for a while, eventually pulling over to sob, which is an understandable reaction to watching all of your friends get eaten by the Falmer. And from there are actually two endings. One of which sees the ghost of Juno pop up in the passenger seat next to Sarah, and then Sarah screaming before it cuts to black. And then there's the other one in which all of that happens, but then Sarah wakes up still inside the cave, but hallucinating having a birthday cake with her daughter. And you would think that the second film would pick up from one of these two endings, right? Wrong. But that's never really addressed in the unplanned, much demanded, and sadly lesser enjoyed sequel. And while that sequel does add a little bit of lore to the crawlers, most of it has to do more with setting up the story of that film than it does explaining their origin or behavior. So I just want to stop and go over what we're dealing with here. Because again, the big question of this entire episode is, could these possibly be real, and could they be kidnapping people? Trust me, I'd love to do a video just on the whole lore behind the crawlers and all that, but the algorithm would not like that. But complaints about that aside, as far as we are aware, the crawlers live underground in an unmapped but technically not undiscovered cave deep in the Appalachians. They're social, cooperative, and intelligent enough to hunt in packs, and the cave art suggests that at some point in their history, they were sentient human beings who primarily lived above ground. And physically, they are still similar in size to humans, but they're a lot more heavily muscled, and they're extremely good climbers. They also have superior hearing, but this is because the many, many years of living underground have rendered them almost totally, if not completely, blind. Finally, they appear to have sharp clawed fingernails in addition to their mouthful of fangs, and though we never see them leaving the caves, piles of animal bones littered throughout several chambers suggest that they do hunt above ground. So, all things considered, there's nothing about them that's entirely impossible, especially given the 10,000 years or more that they've been adapting to these conditions and repeatedly inbreeding. So, thank God they're just movie monsters. Right? If you're interested in missing persons cases, and in particular the missing 411 variety of such stories, there's a good chance you've seen this image. And for those listening and not viewing, it's the classic two maps where the top map shows mysterious cases of people vanishing without a trace, and the bottom map shows America's largest cave systems. And that image alone has probably caused millions of people to take an interest in unsolved disappearances, and I count myself in that number. We've covered a lot of the dots on that top map, including a whole bunch within the Tennessee, North Carolina section of the Appalachians. Most of them turned out to be pretty explainable, But there were a select few which sat just outside the bounds of rationality. And those are the ones which I've always found to be the most interesting, and that's why they've kind of been the core of what we do on this channel. Every once in a while, a movie or TV show or something comes about that posits the question, what if the national parks are home to clans of feral cannibal people? That is how I opened our video on the missing 411 phenomenon and the feral people theory back in January of 2023. Why did I make a video on that? Well, at the time, missing 411 was an absolute juggernaut of a topic in the paranormal and true crime sides of the internet, and the idea that small groups of cannibal wild men were responsible for some of those disappearances was a very popular, we'll call it a hypothesis. Now, this did not apply to all of the stories, and especially not those where the person was found alive or their body was recovered. It also didn't work for certain parts of the country or disappearances in more suburban areas, but there were some where it seemed plausible. The Nahanni River Valley in Canada, with its legends of untamed mountain tribes, seemed like one possible location. The untamed forests of Cascadia and the Canadian Rockies, where the Saskets roamed, another. And above all of them, the forested peaks and mist-filled valleys of Appalachia, where it has been said that the wild men dwell. Most of the focus on so-called feral people seem to be centered on the latter region, and I would say that's in large part due to the notoriety of the Dennis Martin case, and to a lesser extent, the unsolved disappearances of Trenny Gibson and Pauline Melton. For those unfamiliar with those cases, I'll cover them in brief, or you can feel free to pause the video here and go back and watch each of those episodes and then come back. We also have an entire 2.5 hour long video where we actually went to the Smokies and went to the places where these people disappeared. So, but you can see. And when I say cover them in brief, I mean that. We have covered Dennis Martin and Trenny and Pauline ad nauseum on this channel. Like I said, if you want to get the full stories, go and watch those, but I'm just going to give you the short version here. The most recent of these 3 disappearances was that of Thelma Pauline Melton, who went missing on September 25th, 1981. And I think the most succinct way to put it about Pauline Melton is that I have to say that of all the disappearances we looked at in the Great Smoky Mountains, this was one that just I genuinely couldn't comprehend, because we went down to this area. She wasn't even hiking. She was going for a walk on a trail she had been using with her friends for 20 years. She was very familiar with this area. She would literally spend, I believe it was like April through October, living in an RV just outside of the Deep Creek campground in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. This is down on the North Carolina side outside of Bryson City. And this trail, even back in the 1980s, was basically a road. And you go down there now, it's wide, it is graveled, it is a road. You very easily can tell what is not this trail. It's not like when you're hiking through certain areas like, when we were up in Alaska, and this is the part of the video that's completely unscripted because I was eepy. When we were up in Alaska, we were hiking on Mount Marathon, and within minutes of getting on the trail, we were off on the wrong trail. We got totally lost. And I wanted, there was a paved area of that trail, but it was so easy to go off of it and just find yourself completely outside of the marked area. That is not how it is on the Deep Creek Trail. When you're down there, it is so very obvious. There's signage. This is a national park. It's not a locally maintained trail. You have to deliberately try to get off of this trail in order to find your way off of it. Also, Pauline, 58 years old, known for getting very anxious about being off trail, did not like to go off trail. 2-pack-a-day smoker, was not your outdoor active hiker type. We tell stories. There was one we recently did about Karen Sykes out on Mount Rainier. Karen Sykes was known for going off trail. That was her whole thing. She wrote about hidden trails and places that you wouldn't otherwise go out in these mountains. And I have thoughts about Mount Rainier and the underground people, but that's a different story for a different time. Preferably a time when I had more time to write the script. So what I mean to say here is not that, oh, Pauline Melton, well, she was 58, so that means she can't possibly have gone off trail. No, she wouldn't have gone off trail because she hated going off trail. All of her friends said this. And she was an older lady, she was a little bit out of shape, just not the kind of person you're gonna expect to do this. Some people have also said, oh, well, maybe she had to use the restroom, maybe she had to go. Well, when she disappeared, she was only a mile from the RV. So if she had to use the restroom, she's 15, 20 minutes off from being able to do that. On top of that, I've been there, there's not really anywhere to go off trail from the spot where she was last seen. On the one side, there's a very steep slope leading up, and on the other side, there's a very dense, slightly shallower slope that goes about, probably, what would you say, in 30, 40 yards before you hit the creek?
At some points even higher.
Yeah, so it's just not that far. But to give you the basic gist of Pauline Melton's story, she leaves to go for what is, I believe, if I remember correctly, 1.5 miles out and 1.5 miles back. It might have been 2 miles out, 2 miles back. But we're talking 2 to 4 miles on a path that does not have a ton of incline. It's very easy. There's really nowhere to go off trail. The trail is clearly marked. She gets to where their turnaround point is. She turns around, starts heading back, and then she's just walking a little bit faster than her friends. They lose sight of her around a bend. We were able to locate what we think is the exact point where they would have lost sight of her going around that bend, and just vanished. And I want to be clear, the point where she would have disappeared, there's nowhere to get lost. You are literally maybe 50 to 100 yards, again, down a very visible, plain, maintained trail from the bridge where you turn off to go back to where the parking lot is. There is, and again, I want to be clear, there is a bridge leading back to the parking lot. You have to cross that bridge to get to where she was. There is not a bridge on the other side of the trail which goes deeper into the park. So if you hit the bridge on the trail, which you will as long as you don't leave it, you know where to turn. And from there, it's just a straight shot. You just follow the trail back to the parking lot. Are there steep parts where you might, slip and tumble over the edge and hit your head and pass away? Absolutely there are, but the cadaver dogs would have found her. Instead, they find nothing. No sign of a struggle, no sign of bear tracks, no clothes, none of her personal belongings. There's just nothing there, and on top of that, there was no reason to think that she intended to disappear. I mean, we really dug into that, and there was just nothing there. So Pauline Melton just disappears off the face of the earth in broad daylight on a trail at the edge of the national park. The only thing that really feels like it makes sense is if she was kidnapped. But if a person did that, they would have had to carry her down the trail to the parking lot to take her out of the park. If something that lived in the park, however, took her. I want to be clear, I'm not saying that's what I think happened. I'm just saying that when it comes to the unsolved, mysterious missing 411 cases, there's a reason this one's up there for me. It's not that it has to be paranormal, not that it has to be something like feral people. It's just really difficult to wrap your head around how it happened. And of course, one disappearance in the park like that, you might look away and say, nothing weird's going on here. But 5 years before that, at a different part of the park, again, this is a big park, Trenny Gibson, 16-year-old student from a local Knoxville high school, is on a field trip. It's October 8th, 1976. They get up to, it was a trip to Andrews Bald from Klingman's Dome. And that is a surprisingly arduous hike. But the gist of this story, and I will tell you that don't watch our video on this one. I mean, I would love for you to watch our video on this one. But if you're interested in seeing a video on the Trenny Gibson case that doesn't make mistakes, that really gets to every single bit of the details, that has better sourcing than ours did, go watch the Missing Enigmas video on it. His is better. I'm just going to tell you that straight up. Missing Enigma has a better video on it. And I can confirm, because after we put out our video, I got some information from primary sources on this, that his video is correct at basically every stage. I have independently verified that Nick from The Missing Enigma has the best video on this on YouTube. But the gist of the story is that she gets there on a field trip. There's about, I think it was 40 to 50 students and a few chaperones. They go down the trail to Andrews Bald, and then as they're working their way back up, Trenny is with a group of other kids. Apparently she was kind of drifting between groups as they walked back, and this one group with, I believe it was a girl named Bobby, a girl named Anita, and a young man named Scott, they all want to take a break. And they sit down on what they described as a long flat rock on the side of the trail, about a quarter to halfway back to, sorry, I think it was about a quarter to a half mile from the parking lot. And this is a steep trail, so that's not necessarily an easy hike. If you've got time, it's acceptable to take a break here, especially if you've already been all the way out to Andrews Bald. Point of the matter is, they want to take a break. Trenny doesn't. Trenny goes on ahead. They see her once again. This is she rounds a curve, and then they never see her again story. And they don't think anything of it, because there's a bunch of groups ahead of them, there's a bunch of groups behind them, there's chaperones, there's adults, and of course when they get back to the bus, they're going to take a head count and make sure that nobody is missing, which is precisely how they figure out that Trenny's missing. So immediately, as soon as they realize she's not there, the adults, the chaperones, the counselors, the teachers, they hop off the bus and they shoot off in all directions, trying to see where Trenny is. I think each of them goes about a mile, if I remember correctly. They don't find her on any of the trails. They don't find her on the trail down to Andrews Bald. They don't find her on the trail to Klingen's Dome. They go up to the Appalachian Trail, which is about half a mile to a mile north of the parking lot, and they look for a ways on each direction of that, and she's not there. Trenny is nowhere to be found. And for the next several days, the National Park Service launches a massive search effort. They do some of the best work, I think. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park rangers are probably some of the most dedicated search and rescue people in the world. They are absolutely incredible at what they do. They deserve all the praise for it. Can't speak highly enough of them. And as we're recording this, we're currently in a government shutdown, which means they're not being paid. If you want to call your Congress people and ask them about something, maybe ask them to pass legislation that ensures that even during a government shutdown, National Park Service employees get paid, because when they don't and they aren't able to work, people die. Want to be clear, that's not a Republican or Democrat thing. It doesn't matter which side of the aisle you're on. This is probably something we should all be able to agree on, is that our search and rescue staff in our national parks should be paid, right? And I'm not meaning to get off on a political tangent. This is what happens when I don't script the video, but I'm not meaning to go off on a political tangent here. It's just that the national parks are one of the few government agencies that's actually running a profit. They bring in more money than they are allocated by the government every year, year after year, even with these $100,000 price tag search and rescue operations that happen sometimes. So there is really no reason that the National Park Service should not be funded through government shutdowns. They should have their own budget based on the money they bring in that is just supplemented by the government when necessary. Because again, they make a profit. Anyway, back to the issue at hand here, which is the National Park Service in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, some of the most successful, some of the best search and rescue organizers in the world, completely failed to find Trenny. Dogs lead them to all different sorts of places. One dog leads them to the base of Klingen's Dome Tower. Another dog leads them up to the Appalachian Trail, and then actually off of the trail and down to a road. And that's quite a trek to make off trail. Let me just tell you, I haven't been there. For days, I think it's a little over a week, there are large-scale organized searches for Trenny Gibson. They find nothing. And keep in mind, there were people ahead of her, there were people behind her. The group she left were the last people to see her. So she disappeared within a half mile from the parking lot, and with people only 100 yards ahead of her. She just vanishes off the trail. There are some places that she might have hidden if she intended to stay there for some reason, and while initially I thought that this didn't have backing to it, I later received information that confirmed it did. There was a young man with the last name Simpson, I believe it's Robert Simpson, who was seen as a potential person of interest in the case, who she might have been trying to link up with, something like that. Again, weird story, weird situation. I recommend going and watching Missing Enigma's video on the whole thing. Gist of this story, though, is that Trenny Gibson was never found. She disappeared from one of the highest points in the park and just vanished. If there wasn't a human being on that trip, like Simpson, there would be absolutely no real explanation for how she got lost unless she deliberately left the trail, and if she did that, then why? And then, of course, in 1969, the most famous of them all, I believe June 14th, 1969, Dennis Martin. And like the other two, this is in broad daylight, but it is sort of in a weird spot. Now, Spence Field at the time, we've been there since, it is a lot more heavily forested now than it used to be. Back then, it was much more of a field. This used to be a grazing area. Appalachian farmers would bring their cattle up there and graze them for part of the season and then bring them back down. But since it's become a national park and that area has become protected, Spence Field is now full of rhododendrons. And one thing I've said repeatedly on this channel is that in order to really get a feel for how weird these disappearances are, you need to go to the spot where it happened. Because just looking at it on Google Maps isn't going to do it in every case. You're often going to underestimate the terrain looking at a map. But when you're there, you realize just how dense everything is. And the weird thing about Dennis's case is we had a whole bunch of different explanations. Again, I highly recommend watching the full video on this one because it's 2 parts, it's 2 hours long, that's how much material there is here. It gets really weird with the FBI getting involved, and the FBI changes the story that was told by this one other guy who saw some very weird things, tried to tell the authorities about it, they wouldn't listen to him, and so he went to the media, and then after he goes to the media, suddenly the FBI is on his case. And also during this search for Dennis, who disappears while playing with his brothers, or his brother and his cousin, they were like, oh, let's trick our parents, let's sneak around and scare them and everything. You're going to hear a lot of different versions of this story that say that they were playing hide and seek or something like that. That was not really the case. But Dennis was supposed to go one way, and his brother was supposed to go another, and Dennis never reappeared. The last time anybody sees him, he's right at the top of Spence Field, and then he's gone. Now, Dennis was intellectually a little disabled. He was a little bit slow. I believe he was like 2 or 3 years behind his actual age of, I want to say he was 6 or 7. I think he had the mental age of like a 4-year-old. And Dennis just vanishes. And then you get one of the largest scale searches in national park history. There is Army National Guard, forest rangers, hundreds, thousands even of volunteers, his family, you have psychics involved, and you have the Green Berets, Army Special Forces, which at the time were a pretty new thing, and this gets overblown a lot because they were in the area training already. They were just training a few miles south of where Dennis went missing, and they're brought in, but then suddenly in the middle of the search they go radio silent. No more, and again, I've seen criticism of this. It's like, oh, well, Special Forces is always running their own radio frequencies, and also they were training, and, there are all these other They weren't at first. For the first few days they're working hand in hand with the regular National Guard. They're using the same comms and everything. And then suddenly, the park rangers shut off any private or volunteer or national park-led searches of a certain area of the park. The Green Berets go radio silent, and the one time we hear from them is a joint meeting between park staff and the Green Berets, where they start talking about what they're going to do when they find Dennis Martin, and how they're going to call things over the radio, what the procedure is going to be. And then they start looking in a really interesting place. There's a footprint that leads them down to a very specific part of the park, and they basically start doing an operation in a spot called Hog Gap. And then we don't hear anything more about it. They leave a few days later. Nothing is said. Now, a few years after that, there are some remains found that might have been of a child, but the remains were never located. It was just somebody eventually admitted to it. That person had been doing some illegal, I think, like truffle hunting or something like that. So he was worried about getting in trouble, so he didn't come forward about it for a few years. Eventually tells them the Rangers go to look in that spot. They can't find it. But this spot coincides almost perfectly with where Harold Key, the guy who the FBI forced him to change his story, said that he saw some weird things happen. And in particular, a very disheveled-looking man, but that man went to a car. David Paulides has completely screwed the popular perception of this story beyond repair. So anything I tell you right now, unless you've seen our work or Nick's work on it, is probably going to seem different from what you've heard before. But gist of the matter is, Dennis, while surrounded by people, with the trail right there in a field, goes around a bend and is just never seen again. Now, having been there, again, if he had gone further down the trail, if he had gotten off the Appalachian Trail and onto one of the trails leading up from Cades Cove, it'd be very possible for him to fall off and just disappear beneath the brush. It is incredibly thick. There were multiple places where Aiden and I realized that we almost were gonna, if we hadn't been looking, we would have fallen off of the trail, and there were spots where it was 10 feet down through very thick bushes, and you just would never find somebody down there unless dogs managed to locate them. And that's kind of the weirdest part about Dennis Martin's story, is that the dogs totally fail. Cadaver dogs don't find him, scent tracking dogs don't find him, massive searches don't find him. He's just gone. So over the course of just 11 years, we have 3 disappearances where nobody actually saw the person go missing, but the person went missing from a place from where people shouldn't go missing. Now, do I think that feral people are the only explanation for any of those disappearances? Of course not. In fact, I'm rather confident that Trenny was abducted by Simpson. The other 2, however, I'm not so sure. The Dennis Martin story wouldn't be nearly as strange if not for the sudden radio silence from the Green Berets and the bizarre interference from the FBI, but Thelma's case, I must say, just genuinely baffles me. I've been to the locations of all 3 of these disappearances, and hers just doesn't make any sense. It's not a difficult trail, she wasn't deep into the woods, and there were no other factors which could have explained it. Does that mean that she was abducted by cave-dwelling feral people? The answer seems like it should be an emphatic no, but for one pesky detail. There's kind of a precedent for it. You see, The Descent, the movie, takes place in Appalachia, North Carolina, which is deep into historic Cherokee territory. And here, the protagonists find themselves fighting against a bunch of pale-skinned, blind cave dwellers whose presence goes back to the Stone Age. Does that sound familiar? Don't worry if it doesn't. I only thought of this because we literally just did an episode on the Moon-Eyed People. That said, it sounds a lot like the descriptions of the Moon-Eyed People, and especially like one supplied to me by one of our commenters. In rewatching The Descent for this video, I figured that Neil Marshall must have been aware of the Moon-Eyed People when he wrote the movie, so I was actually shocked when I discovered that this was, at least as far as he's concerned, an original concept unrelated to that piece of folklore. At the same time, I do believe him, because I would never have made that connection based on what I myself knew about the story prior to receiving the aforementioned comment. To give you the basis of the legend as I understood it after writing our Moon-Eyed People video, the Cherokee told early American ethnographers that when they first arrived in the Appalachians, they encountered a race of moon-eyed people whom they eventually fought for control of the region. These people were supposedly light-skinned, with extremely poor eyesight, and depending on who is telling the story, the Cherokee either defeated and exiled them, or in the bloodier version, exterminated them. Unfortunately, most of the American writing about this story has more to do with the legend of the Welsh Indians we talked about in that episode, and I've been unable to find any Cherokee sources on the issue. Ethnographers of the era tended to either fully endorse the Welsh Indian perspective, ignoring the ways in which that didn't really line up with what the Cherokee were saying, or write the Moon-Eyed People off as a folktale recalling some ancient war against another tribe, much like what appears to be the case with the Site Ka of Lovelock Cave out in Nevada. Yes, we have a video on that too. And, you know, as I was reading through all of this material, it didn't really occur to me that in the 1800s, ethnographers might not think to ask if the Cherokee were talking about something else entirely. At least, not at first. I was reading through the comments on the Moon-Eyed People video the other day when I stumbled across one from a user named Allison, who identified herself as Cherokee and told me that the version told in her community is much different from the ones I'd compiled. Like the accounts I'd read, her Moon-Eyed People predated the Cherokee by an unknown span of time, but they didn't live in fortified villages like John Sevier reported. They didn't build walls atop mountains, and they never went westward up the Missouri. No, her Moon-Eyed People lived underground, where their pale skin and milky eyes were safe from the harsh rays of the sun. At night, they raided villages, stole food, and kidnapped children, refusing to stop even when the Cherokee tried to make peace or trade deals with them. If they still exist, she concluded, it is very deep in the earth where humans don't go. Then, in a follow-up, she added another critical detail. They were man-eaters. On Allison's recommendation, I've reached out to the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians to request further information and clarification about the story, so I'll refrain from speculating any further, but I found those similarities striking. I mean, how bizarre that in the one place in America where you kind of constantly have these stories of feral people, again, with very little factual basis to them, but a lot of folklore, you also have ancient Cherokee legends about precisely the same thing. And these are things that don't show up in the academic materials. They're not showing up in the historical or the literary record. These appear to stem from two completely different sources. You have people in the Appalachians talking about wild men. And I don't just mean like wild men like the people who live in the park off the grid, because those exist. I mean things like the tree knockers, these humanoids or even people who communicate by knocking on the trees and hooting in the wilderness and things like that. And then you have this story of the Moon-Eyed People, and they seem to derive from different origins. They're not. It doesn't feel like the wild men legends we get from white settlers in the region and from later stories were an adaptation. They don't feel like they derive from the Cherokee legends. They seem to have developed on their own. And it's not just there, and one of the things that I find most interesting about this too, and obviously this would not make sense on a geologic timescale, but we get similar stories of troglodytic or troglophilic cave-dwelling humanoids, for lack of a better word, that live in the mountains and the caves of Britain. And then you find some in Europe. Usually these are classified more as goblins, but you still hear about them. We do seem to have a collective folkloric cultural memory of cave dwellers. Does that go back to very, very ancient times, like 40, 50,000 years ago? Maybe. But why are we afraid of them? I think back to that genetic memory creepypasta that I read all those years ago, and the one, the excerpt of it I read at the beginning of this episode. And the more I think about it, the more I study, the more it really does seem like there was something at some point back there that was hunting us. We weren't always the apex predator, but was it another kind of hominid? And of course, if that kind of hominid did still exist, and we didn't know about it, the only place it could theoretically live would be in the caves. And that led me to ask, is that possible? What would you need for that to be true? And there was one guy that came to mind. And I'm going to let him talk about it now.
Human history has several gray areas, so to speak, that we look at and wonder, well, what could have happened in this time frame? And to that point, likely due to these points in history, have we ever really stopped to think that maybe that could result in things that we deal with at this current point in time? The Descent, in my mind, is the most clear example of proposing an idea that could, for all intents and purposes, be closer to reality than we may initially think. And the reality is, we as a species do this quite regularly. Whenever we do not know exactly what took place or how it could have happened in the first place, I suppose, it's quite natural for our brains to fill in the missing gaps of knowledge to help explain what may have happened. To this end, how do we explain just the sheer amount of people that go missing within the mountains of Appalachia? I mean, we've all heard the sayings, some more ridiculous than others, if your trash cans are tipped over in Appalachia, run, or some stupid nonsense like that. But there are very real warnings about this area. Many people go missing every year within its peaks and dense forests. And with that, the question has always remained. Is it just exposure and natural causes, or is there something else going on? Maybe something a little more strange than we could have at first suspected. And to that end, could there be something lurking out there within the expansive cave systems of this area? The reality of that is it's entirely possible if we base that information and line of thought on other allegedly identified creatures that have been said to lurk. So I think the first thing that we need to start, since Aiden has set up pretty much the premise of the movie and what is going on, is to jump straight into the physiology of these creatures, as this may help to explain how they survive the actual depths of the cave systems, but then we can move on to where they may have actually come from in the first place, as it's more possible than you may have first imagined. Which actually, I've explained this on my main channel prior, but considering this is an entirely different audience, likely, it'll be new to you. Starting with the feet, these creatures, while able to crawl on walls, actually appear to sport plantigrade structuring of the feet. Plantigrade structuring would indicate that they are persistent hunters, much like humanity is, or at minimum, they hail from this lineage to a degree. Now, do they come from humans or something else? Well, we'll get there momentarily. Do not worry your pretty striped head. Body structure is quite important to determining the actual environment and usage the creature may get out of its meat suit. So as we look at them, one of the few things we need to discuss is the wall crawling, but also be aware, it appears as though these creatures have like more calloused skin than normal, which would help them in cave systems, considering they would be running into walls. But along with that, with thicker skin, they're able to retain more heat, which is how they are able to survive in the caves in general. So, while this creature is clearly able to use its claws as countermeasures against the women, hacking and slashing, in this updated video, I severely doubt this creature is using its claws to actually dig into rock. Instead, it is much more likely that it is pushing against the rock itself, holding itself up. Now, this would take an insane amount of core strength, as you might guess, which given everything that we have seen with this creature is pretty clear it is quite strong. It does not appear to have any more skeletal muscle than just your average man, but I believe I do have a line of thought that may connect how it is able to achieve what it does, and it's based on neurological capacities the brain imposes on musculature contractions, which we will also get there too. Then as we take a look at its legs in general, the body plan remains the same. Persistence hunting. The knees are exactly like Homo sapiens, forward-facing, and as you can call, the calves area, it appears to be the same, and we can assume then the Achilles tendon exists to store up energy for the next step, much like ours does. This would indicate to me that this is a subspecies that appears to have entered these caves at least relatively recently concerning this entire hominid's lineage. However, given that they sport some adaptations of the body making cave life suitable, and yet still maintain their abilities concerning leg structures similar to man, this would put them actually at like a troglazine category. And what is that, I can hear you asking? And if you didn't, too bad. There are essentially three main classes of cave dwellers depending on behaviors. troglobites, troglozines, and troglophiles. Troglobites are true cave dwellers. These guys are 100% adapted to living in cave conditions and exist almost exclusively within caves. In fact, there was a completely translucent species that was discovered recently where you can actually see their internal organs functioning through their skin. With these species, they are extremely susceptible to sunlight and exist only within cave systems. Think of like certain types of salamanders without the eyes and crayfish without the eyes. Basically, if you don't have eyes, you're probably a troglobite. So anyways, the next is the troglozine. This species is kind of like cave adjacent. They're only a temporary user of the cave system and will transiently survive there. Things like bats and raccoons, but more so bats, as they will actually sleep in caves during the day, as we all know, and then go out at night to hunt insects and, well, pretty much insects. It also cannot be ignored that structurally the faces of the crawlers are incredibly close to bats that actually inhabit the cave systems, so convergent evolution cannot be ruled out, and based on this would indicate that the crawlers have been in this cave system for quite some time. And lastly, you have creatures like troglophiles who love caves, and yet they can live independently. These creatures could be like ancient man back in the day when we used caves to survive. Basically, in reality, caves can be quite nice. Earth has a summer and Earth has a winter. Fall is clearly the most goated time frame, but given most caves exist at around 55 to 60 degrees year-round, the reality is, while that's not incredibly warm, if you were completely exposed, you may end up becoming a little too cold, but if you're able to wear some furs or build a small fire, that would be plenty to keep you warm in a cave system. And during the summer, there is that sweet spot between the mouth of the cave system and the coolness of the cave itself where you could exist and just cool down. It's basically like air conditioning back in the day. But along with this, it keeps you out of the elements entirely. Okay, so back to the physiology. As we move up to the abdomen, we see these creatures are pretty much structured exactly like a human would be, which I don't believe they are human. Trust me, we're going to get there. It's basically me in the mailroom connecting pictures of creatures, explaining how nobody actually works in this building. We're at that level of speculation. Now, the rest of the body is, for our purposes, pretty boring. The thoracic area is not anything special, and the shoulders exist with more well-defined lateral and anterior deltoid areas, given that they are crawling around. However, they do have a fair amount of body fat, also given that, there are, I guess, troglozines. It's kind of interesting that they would have this much body fat, but the biceps and triceps are a little more sinewy, given that the crawlers are, after all, constantly using their arms to walk as well, which causes them to be more defined. The forearms exist simply as they would on humans, and the hands sport 4 fingers and 1 thumb per hand. Pretty much, their physiology does not indicate really any deviations from humanity, but when we get to the face, that's where the money shot is. Much like for most humans, the face is quite important as it signals many things about the actual genetics of this creature. In humans, we've all been dumb and absolutely ignored every red flag on the planet for a sharp jawline, or in my case, what I would consider pretty eyes and like a nice smile. It happens to the best of us. But that is really how it be sometime. But the reason for this to exist amongst humanity is that the face is actually a structure that takes a lot of finely tuned genetics and expression of those genes all coming together in a way to a creature that would probably call it attractiveness. This indicates the health of the potential mate, along with how we pretty much judge most of our species. Because of this, when we look at the crawler, for their faces to have been changed to the level that they are, this indicates a completely divergent pathway concerning their own evolution that broke away from probably a subspecies a long time ago. So as we look at their faces, the first thing we see are the teeth. They are exceedingly sharp. Humans' teeth are developed in a way that we are actually omnivores, and we kind of have more flat teeth because typically we just don't use them for hunting or inflicting damage on something and then causing it to bleed out. We have developed tools for this purpose, so our teeth never really had a chance to be anything more than what they are right now. Because of this, with our species, the temporalis muscle is not all that important, and this actually allowed for the sagittal crest of the skull to move outwards, which then allowed for our brains to increase in size because the muscle attachment points did not need to be as robust. Given that the crawlers also possess this same formation on their skulls, it's quite important to kind of what we're talking about currently in a hypothesis that I'm going to suggest. As we look at their noses, they are quite large and have turned mostly into slits. The question would remain, have they always been this way? Well, we're going to get there in a second, but as we move up to the eyes, they have turned a milky white coloring, likely due to the atrophying of living in a dark cave. It is highly likely with this species that they actually do leave the cave to hunt, as seen with deer carcasses in the cave system, and the fact that their legs still exist in a plantigrade structuring. But given that they very likely only go out at night due to their skin being as pale as it is, and along with their eyes turning this color, resulting in legitimate blindness, they have a new hunting technique which brings us around to their ears. The ears of these creatures share a direct convergent evolutionary pathway with bats of any other cave system, which indicates to me a new hunting technique has formed amongst these creatures that is both a leg up and detrimental to them should their prey be smart enough. The ears are pointed and face forward much like a bat's would. The purpose is clear. These creatures hunt by a form of echolocation. When in the cave system, they can let out likely an ultrasonic click. Ultrasonic just meaning it's at a higher frequency than humans can hear. Should you be standing still and these creatures click, they cannot really see you as the sound waves bounce off and nothing has changed in their environment. However, if you do choose to move, the sound will actually change and their ears can detect it. So this is almost like a level of neuroplasticity over time at its finest on a species level, which we will call adaptation. For the environments humans typically lived in, 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz, that's kind of where we can hear. The noises generated in our environment meant that those who could hear this range were much more likely to survive. In reality, if the parameters changed for any reason, there is no reason over time humans couldn't adapt and actually have our range of hearing change as a result. So the crawlers are the greatest example of this. As their eyes atrophied from being in this cave system, eyesight would become less viable over time, and new hunting traits would emerge, which in this case is echolocation. By emitting clicks, their ears could direct sound to the hair cells of their ears, which then appears like much how the occipital lobe of the brain for regular humans is pulling double duty, I guess is the best way you could put it. The temporal lobe would largely take over the task of navigating and hunting by interpreting sounds and effectively seeing the area by listening. So the question is, where did these come from in the first place? Are they human? Neanderthal? Well, actually, I believe it to be neither, and I actually think they are much older than that. Like, way older, based on context clues that we can see. So let's start with the most obvious. The face is not something easily changed, and the living conditions are not either. Let's take Homo sapiens, for instance, and place them in a cave system. Even after generations, it is highly unlikely that they are going to, if having any access to outside of the cave system, which clearly these creatures do, stay in there and just change as their brain is developed in a way that would likely include expansions. Like, humans love expanding across the planet. It's just what we do. Okay, but let's say they got trapped. Inbreeding could amplify traits in their bodies, but my main issue with even my own theory 4 years ago on my original video is if we look at these creatures, it's the faces that have mostly changed. And for these faces to change to this level, it is incredibly unlikely that there would not be physical mutations that would have arisen in the body itself. Limb deformities are much more likely to arise in those who interbreed, and yet when we look at this species, it's clear once again the faces have undergone a massive change. The actual limb structures appear largely non-impacted by the reproduction practices of their species. How many times have I said species? Don't take a shot. Every time you hear it, you will not survive. But anyways, so where did they come from then? So let's take a trip back, shall we? Way back in the day. I'm talking before Homo sapiens was even a thing. Now, there are different takes on this, and the reality is we are still finding things to this day that indicate, well, that's weird. But there is a skull called, I believe it's the Union skull or something like that. Anyways, they found it back in 1990, and this skull is stated to be about 940,000 to 1.1 million years old. The issue is, it's a human skull. And this kind of makes the problem of like the out of Africa theory, puts us leaving the continent around roughly about 100,000 years ago. So which is it? Did we come from Africa, Asia, or God? It seems like a debate is kind of going to rage for pretty much ever until the lights go out. But the point is, humanity may be much older than we initially thought. And as we discover more about our own origins, what we do know, at least for now, is other hominids have come before us. And this may be where our uncanny valley concept actually comes from. And if you aren't sure what that is, I'm here to tell you. Essentially, all those creepy videos online of something that is almost human, that kind of give you this weird feeling. Like, why does that freak us out? Why does it make us feel uneasy like something is wrong? Well, likely it comes from the underlying feeling of not interbreeding with an incompatible species. There was a time when several hominids were likely around at the same time humanity was. In an effort to preserve humanity and our genetics, our own drives would indicate to us that we need to interbreed with our own species, and from that, culture, customs, social norms, all that would grow. It's sort of like why we smile at each other, but if a chimpanzee smiles at another chimpanzee, it's not good. Stuff like that. So if another species that sort of looks like us tried to interact, our brains would naturally see some deviations, likely in the face, and be like, that thing isn't human, which would make us feel uneasy. Given that we are the last ones standing currently, or as far as we know, this leftover trait still exists within us despite it not really being an issue that we have to face today. Now, this is just my personal thinking on it. You're not really going to likely find that from some professor or anything. I think it's just sort of like a leftover drive that we have to associate with our own species and then reproduce, which brings us back to that skull in particular. Given the concept of evolution has considerable overlap between different types of hominids, if you are taking physical geography into account, let's say you're like a Homo erectus at this point, which is assumed to be a step before Homo sapiens. You drop them into two areas, as we know. Homo erectus did push out of Africa long, apparently before sapiens would, and then they ended up in Asia, where they would continue to change into Neanderthalensis or sapiens, just depending on, how, because we found a human skull in Asia. That's what that concept is based on. The old concept, I believe, is Homo erectus pushed out of Africa and then entered Europe and Asia, where they became Neanderthals, and sapiens continued to form in Africa over time, but it's kind of appearing maybe like that might not be the case. But anyways, there were still human skulls forming in Africa, so they were changing in Africa in a standard progression into sapiens as well, just a different variant due to environmental constraints. What you have is likely Homo erectus still existing in several areas, while sapiens are also starting to pop up, just like Neanderthal was starting to pop up too. The reality is there's not really a clean line between erectus and sapiens. You couldn't take just one generation between the two species and say, yep, that's when it happened. It's just kind of just changes over time. So you're probably saying, yes, Roanoke, that's a long-winded explanation for Uncanny Valley, but why does it matter? Well, it matters because it explains these creatures perfectly. The reality is, based on the skull, we could potentially make the assumption that humans may have been humans a million years ago in Asia, and if that is the case, even prior to that, erectus had to be in this area. How much earlier? Well, early enough, I guess, that there was enough time for them to become sapiens in Asia, unless this was just totally uninhabited prior, and even then, that would still put humans in the area like a million years ago, which is a long time ago. So let me ask you this. If humans were already in Asia for a million years, what do you think the odds of man not crossing the several land bridges that formed over the last millions of years between Asia and North America? The reality is, again, man is naturally expansive. It's why we are the greatest animals on the planet. Don't at me. Humanity number one, baby. Along with that, Beringia, as it was called, would have formed about a million years ago due to the Ice Age at that time, which put water levels 125 meters lower than they are now, which is, I know, I hate using meters. It's heathen units, but in the Lord's based units, that's around 410 feet lower. This, coupled with ice, connected the two continents that would have easily allowed for man to cross. So really, what are we looking at? Earth, about a million years ago, looked very similar to how it looks now, as tectonic drift is a very slow process. I would suggest man, or even erectus, may have actually moved across the continental bridge at some point in time, well into the past. I'm inclined to believe it was erectus that would have done it first, as they naturally expanded as well, and if you look at the faces between erectus and also the crawlers, they are very similar considering the brow ridges taken into account. So in doing so, eventually small bands would move across the continent of North America, and given that they walked upright like man, but just had more hair on their bodies and tool usage was limited, they may have just maintained their sharper teeth, although it should be known Homo erectus was not really far behind man when it came to the use of fire and tools. And as they stuck to the cave systems, once again, getting to Appalachia because it does get cold there, something would have to happen. A group would have to get stuck somehow, possibly due to a cave-in, blocking the exit, or maybe like an earthquake sealing them in elsewhere. But this band, or would it be tribe? Probably be tribe at this point with Homo erectus, would have to get stuck in a specific cave system. Clearly, much like other ecosystems, they would need to become part of a sustainable food web where they must have had to survive off something within those systems. At first, this would be difficult as their bodies adapted and atrophying of their eyes would take place and their ears would change over time and their brains likely didn't continue on the same protein-driven paths that man's did. That's, why our brains are as big as they are, because we had access to a lot more protein. But what we are witnessing is potentially a species of erectus that got stuck in caves and then adapted to their environments and now leave those caves at night to hunt. Once they changed enough, delineating themselves from the other erectus species and clearly not being human, something in the past would allow for them to either exit the caves before they completely lost their ability to persistence hunt, but their sensory structures would be forever changed in order to survive within the caves. From here, this tribe of erectus could leave the cave and hunt, but they do not do it in the sun, so they will return to the cave systems as that is their home. This likely means at a later point in time, if they continue to expose themselves to the surface, because this may have just been a recent event, then it is very likely that they could readapt to the outside of the cave, and potentially even in later generations, their eyesight could return. But for now, we are effectively seeing a trapped form of erectus that would adapt to the cave system life, but only recently, potentially within the last few generations, being able to exit and hunt outside of the cave. And then humans show up, interacting with them, which this species would just kind of regard as food. But unfortunately for them, it was man who was made in God's image, not you, creature.
I'd like to thank Jacob for providing us with that fantastic little segment right there. If you want to catch his entire video on the subject, it is over on the Roanoke Gaming channel, where you can find it. I believe it's about 4 years old, and I'll put the link in the description for it because I can't remember the title off the top of my head right now. Phenomenal video, great work, great narration. He's got a great sense of humor. If you're not already subscribed to Roanoke Tales or Roanoke Gaming, definitely go give them a subscription, give him your views. He deserves it. And because this is a video with just so many special guest hosts, I am going to toss it over to my producer, the man behind the camera, or currently to the left of it, Aidan Thornbury.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Mattis. And as he said, today I'm going to go through a little bit about the production of the Descent film. Obviously, there's going to be a bit of a departure from what we normally talk about here, so bear with me. If you're not interested, feel free to skip it. But if you are, prepare, buckle up, because it's going to get nitty-gritty. Despite the horrifying nature of the crawlers and the fearful possibility that, however improbable, something in the way of these creatures may exist in the deep, dark tunnels of the Appalachians, for now all we have to worry about is that which exists beyond the protection of an LED screen. And today, I'd like to explain a bit about how the creative team behind the 2005 film The Descent achieved these terrifying results, and a little bit about how filmmaking works in a way that most behind-the-scenes marketing documentaries don't. The Descent was conceived by writer-director Neil Marshall, an at-the-time seasoned director that has gone on to become a veteran of the industry with recent large productions like that of the Hellboy reboot in 2019, and guest directing spots on acclaimed shows like Game of Thrones, Westworld, Hannibal, and one of my favorites, Black Sails. In conversation about the concept of the film, Marshall noted that he, quote, always wanted to do a horror film set in a cave, and that horror films are best set in the dark, and you can't get any more dark than this. The element of the crawlers, despite showing up quite late in the film, came nearly as early as the cave concept itself. After the success of Marshall's previous film, Dog Soldiers, in 2002, he was approached numerous times to do another horror film, and despite being fearful of being typecast as a horror director, he eventually agreed to produce a film once he'd felt that he had a unique enough story from his last. One of the unique elements of this movie was the choice to have an all-female cast, which came from Neil's business partner about midway through the development of the film, as the story was initially intended to have a mix of men and women. As he was developing the characters, Marshall chose to give each of them unique accents to help the audience further differentiate them and to give them a bit of a more cosmopolitan feel, and to provide the actors with a greater opportunity of creating depth to the characters, which was a point of focus for both Marshall and the cast throughout the production in a variety of ways. And speaking of the cast, it was made up of an ensemble of Shauna McDonald as the protagonist, Sarah, Natalie Mendoza as Juno, providing the human antagonist within the story, Alex Reed as Beth, Saskia Mulder as Rebecca, Miana Buring from the Witcher series acclaim as Sam, and Irish actress Nora Jane Noon as Holly, playing a spunky mid-2000s lesbian-coded friend of the group, who I personally know from playing Garda Kate Noonan in the Irish-German series Jack Taylor, starring Ian Glenn, also of Game of Thrones fame, as Jorah Mormont, sporting yet another beautiful coat which I have added to my obsession collection of on-screen goat coats. Any piece of media where someone wears a solid coat or jacket, I'm unreasonably interested in. Let me know if you want to see a ranking of my favorite on-screen coats. There's no reason that you should want that, but give me the reason and I'll absolutely do it. Anyway, back to Beneath the Ground. Once the cast was assembled, Marshall and other members of the production team began the final stages of pre-production. As Marshall locked in the designs for the set with production designer Simon Bowles, and continued to hone creature design with special effects and makeup designer Paul Hyatt, the cast was put through a week-long course of training and exercise in rock climbing and whitewater rafting, allowing them to become more familiar with and eventually fluent in the tactile language of scaling rock. This is a common practice among filmmakers aiming to achieve an extra layer of realism in their films, not only for the sake of the audience, but also the actors as well. If you have a production that requires some form of technical or physical skill that many of the actors may not be familiar with ahead of shooting, attempting to wing it in these areas causes a duality of weaknesses in the performance. For one, even if the audience is not familiar with that skill, they do have a subconscious understanding of watching someone who also has no idea what they're doing. In storytelling, this can kind of ruin the suspension of disbelief, or more plainly, the ability for the audience to accept the fictitious story as some kind of reality. When a person watching your film or show is taken out of the experience, it can be hard to get them reinvested in what's happening. And especially for things relying on a theatrical run, it can be hard to get them to recommend to their friends to watch the film. Word of mouth is still one of the most prominent means of marketing for the film industry. The second issue stems from the experience the actor has in the scene. If they're not familiar enough with the task at hand as to appear an expert like their character is supposed to be, they will oftentimes be splitting their focus between delivering the emotional impact of the dialogue and action related to the story within the scene, while also distracting themselves with attempting to accurately maneuver the technicalities of whatever activity they're supposed to be doing. This compounds the previous problem of the suspension of disbelief, while simultaneously dragging down the quality of the emotional performance. To negate this, productions will oftentimes do some level of boot camp prior to filming any production requiring specialized skills. Many war films are prime examples of this, with my personal favorite being Master and Commander: The Far Side of the World, which came out in 2003. Part of why that film is in my top 3 favorite movies of all time is as a direct result of the effort the cast and production team put in the pursuit of realism, all the way down to the direction of the twist of the ropes in the rigging of the ships. The way they trained the actors was by providing them colored t-shirts representative of their ranks within the British naval structure of the Napoleonic era, and then they ran them through a crash course in sailing and naval combat, including hoisting sails, melee combat, and cannon gun work. The officers were even given their own separate club to increase camaraderie among them and to create the separation from them and the enlisted and pressed sailors. Here, just as with the Descent, the time and effort pursued in pre-production lent itself to a heightened quality of the final product of the performances of the actors. Another level of performance came from the actors portraying the crawlers. And I specify actors as Neil Marshall did because despite the possibility of hiring other types of performers such as dancers to be able to achieve the physical performances of the contortions and movement required, Neil chose to hire actors due to the desire to have the emotional nuances emanate through the prosthetics in a way that only actors could, as he saw it. In a comment on the details of this depth of character for the crawlers, Marshall noted that the crawlers are, quote, cavemen who didn't leave the cave, and they evolved in this environment over thousands of years. A community of them live down here. There's families, and they thrive in this underground environment. They've lost their eyesight, they have acute hearing and smell, and they're expert climbers so they can go up any rock face, and they function perfectly in the pitch black. And that is their world. And these girls infringe upon their world, and the crawlers are simply defending their territory. In pursuit of providing the ability for his backstory to show through performance, Marshall hired a team of actors led by longtime collaborator Craig Conway. The physical characteristics of the crawlers were honed over a long period of time through pre-production and up through production. Director Neil Marshall provided an initial Photoshop design influenced by creatures like Nosferatu to special effects makeup and designer Paul Hyatt, who then took the work and created a prototype prosthetic mask and suit. The first rendition was very Gollum-like, in reference to the character from Lord of the Rings, with extremely large eyes and desiccated skin. Hyatt and his team proceeded to refine the design in a series of clay sculptures, progressively deciding to make the creatures look more and more human, but retaining some vampiric design qualities such as the pointed bat-like ears, motivated by the in-world echolocation abilities. The suits themselves were full prosthetics, with rubber masks and body pieces applied with adhesives, custom painted on details, and contact lenses all adhered and removed every day that there were crawlers on set. The initial makeup time took 5 hours for application, but through the duration of filming, they were able to get that process down to 3.5 hours. In terms of the movement of the crawlers, they also seem to have used a technique called speed ramping, which involves recording the action of a character or object at 1 frame rate, and adjusting the rate in post-production to make them appear to move at different speeds in the final product. In this case, speeding up the footage to make them appear to move faster. But this is a camera trick, and we'll touch more on the cameras and their importance in the film later. One thing to note here about filmmaking and film sets is that they are the epitome of time is money. On some of the largest sets, you have hundreds, if not thousands of individuals working on each given day. Food is required to be provided to the workers on set, and housing is required. Drivers for both the talent and equipment are necessary. Every single member of the cast and crew is paid on a day rate. All food and housing is paid by the day. Another day of shooting could mean as much as another $1 million, and at times more is spent. So in the film industry, every attempt to shrink the shooting schedule to as short as humanly possible is taken. This means long hours for the whole crew. Union limits are officially 12 hours of rest and meals provided every 6 hours, But often it's cheaper to incur the penalties and work the crew for up to 14 to 16 hours, granted they do get overtime pay. This does not include things like travel to and from set, or, usually, hair and makeup. For more conventional films and television with limited makeup requirements, this often would only mean showing up about an hour before call time, which is the time when you're required to show up to set to actually work. But on a production like this, with heavy special effects makeup for both the crawlers and the ensemble cast when their injuries begin to manifest, the days are even longer and they get even less rest. Long-term production strain like this can lead to dangerous outcomes if union rules are not properly enforced. A prime example is an incident that occurred on the production of Smallville, when series lead Tom Welling, driving home from yet another 16-hour day, fell asleep at the wheel and nearly ran off the road during his commute back to his apartment. As a result of this not being the first time that incident occurred, the remainder of the cast signed a petition to have a driver hired for Welling, to provide for not only his safety, but for the potential of getting 2 more hours of sleep on the journey to and from set each day, as opposed to the maximum of 6 he might have been getting if he had remained driving. Details like this are a part of the web of logistics productions have to run, not only to provide an entertaining and engaging product, but to ensure it is done in a safe manner. For as elegant as it appears on red carpets and in interviews, most of the film industry's day-to-day is very much a labor job, and the same safety factors that carpenters and electricians might have to account for when building a home, or logistics truckers and caterers might have to account for when traveling and providing food for an event, all of that has to be considered on a film set. It is the culmination of just about every profession all at once, every day, for weeks or months at a time. Speaking of weeks on set, this production had a shooting schedule of 7 weeks for all the material, both on location in the UK for certain external scenes, and on the cave sets at Pinewood Studios near London, England, which are in fact the same studios where the sets for the original Star Wars trilogy were constructed and filmed. Due to budget constraints, production designer Simon Bowles was only able to construct 6 variations of the cave sets, forcing him to have to mix and match different portions of the pieces and dress them with different materials to make it appear like drastically different areas of the caves. To achieve this, he and his team would have one section be dry, dusty, and mostly in rock styling like that of something near the surface, while other renditions would be dripping wet with hundreds of wax stalactites and stalagmites covering the walls. For one portion, a 50 square foot tank was built to hold approximately 1 inch of water to create the lagoon portion that you see later in the film. For the consumption chamber, or as the production team called it, the bone den, the prop department created over 1,000 bones and bone structures to line the set, creating a massive scale of death and decay. The bloodbath scene was created using a literal bathtub extended out from the top to create the illusion of a well of blood. This also helped to create the dark red atmosphere of the lower levels of the caves, enhanced by the red flares and torches emanating the amber and ruby light across the walls. Speaking of lights, this is one of the major reasons director Neil Marshall created a story within a cave, due to the natural absence of the light within it. However, as some of you may be aware, light is an essential part of creating an image. Without it, we might as well be listening to an audiobook. So despite the light restriction, they still needed something to allow us to see our heroes and villains in these dark caverns. The way to practically, or otherwise known as provide an on-screen logical reason, to provide the light was through the tools previously mentioned, along with flashlights, glow sticks, and phosphorescent rocks. But, as any of you who have attempted to make home movies might have discovered, using tools like these, they often don't do a great job of casting compelling light throughout the scene, and oftentimes they make things appear washed out or poorly lit, with a bland contrast and poor depth. This is where the science of cinematography comes into the equation. The production team used both the RECam ST and the RECam LT, a smaller packaged version of the ST, both of which utilized 35mm film stock. Considering the film was shot in 2004 for a 2005 release, physical film was still the standard, as digital was just still being refined and only had just been used for release for the first time with Star Wars The Phantom Menace 5 years prior. The film stock they used was Fujifilm Eterna 500T 8573, a stock that is no longer in production, like many film stocks, but used on a variety of films in the mid-2000s, such as The Mist. This is an interesting and informative choice because Fujifilm stocks differ from what some might consider to be the standard of Kodak film stocks in their unique color representation. Whereas Kodak aims to provide a final look that closely resembles what the human eye sees, Fuji intentionally designs their film to have a unique color output, making things more stylized, contrasted, and vibrant depending on the film stock. This is particularly noticeable in the opening segment of the film, before we get into the cave. The wilderness appears to have what some might call the twilight filter applied, but that's more a result of the film stock choice than any post-processing, though I'm sure some was applied, though limited. This pre-production color selection based on the film stock type is very much in contrast to how productions pursue their workflow today, which heavily relies on after-the-fact color grading to achieve the desired look, meaning that the footage captured in camera is often intentionally as neutral as possible, so the director has maximum latitude in editorial to choose how the film will look upon release. Once you capture a frame of film, there's only so much you can change it beyond the limitations of the chemical composition of the exposed frame. But with modern raw image data being captured by 12 and 16-bit color space cameras, often the sky's the limit. Once your camera's chosen, next you have to choose the lenses. This production used Zeiss Ultra Primes, a series of very compact and fast lenses, meaning that they have a particularly wide, full-open aperture of t1.9. And for those of you that are wondering what t is, that might be familiar with cameras that are f1.9 or f2.8, t-stops are very similar to f-stops, but they are more exact. F-stops are kind of an approximation that we use in photography, but due to cinema cameras and lenses requiring far more precise measurements, t-stops are exact measurements. It's basically the same thing, just minor differentiation in terminology, but in case you were confused, that's an explanation. Anyway, these fast lenses allow more light onto the film than many other lenses on the market, making it a perfect pairing with the Fujifilm Eterna 500T for low light work. That 500T simply means that the film has an ISO rating of 500, and the white balance is set to the color temperature of tungsten lights, the T, which were the standard film lights for decades until fluorescence and now especially LEDs have taken over the dominant role. This is in comparison to most film stock, which have ISO ratings of about 100 or 50, mainly used for external daytime or internal work. This sensitivity to light came at a perceived cost, however, as the particles of the film itself, known as grains, needed to be larger in order to be able to effectively absorb all of that light. This meant that the final product would have a grainier look to it, but for this production, already leaning towards a stylized film with the Fuji stock, this only added to the grittiness of the horror cave setting. Despite fast lenses and grainy stock, the torches and flares were still not enough to illuminate the frames, and that's to be expected. This is where the expertise of the cinematographer began to rely on the help of his team, the gaffers in the grip department, to add in light sources to illuminate the parts of the frame that the flares just wouldn't reach. For the less drastically colored light sources, this was easy enough. To have and hide light sources off-screen pointed at elements of the cave in a direction that coincided with where the light of the practical source was already hitting. But, as you may remember from a moment ago, I told you the film stock was balanced for tungsten lights, which is warmer than LEDs, but by no means red. So how did they get those beautiful shots of the cave walls bathed in the ruby glow? Today, we'd simply order an RGB LED from a rental house and adjust the dial to the desired hex code of color we want, but back in the day with film, we didn't have multicolored lights to accommodate our color needs. To achieve the dramatic looks seen here, and in many other films throughout history, gaffers would apply something known as gels, which are sheets of colored plastic, to the front of tungsten light sources on the flaps hanging in their front with something called C47 clips, which you would know as clothespins. They did and still do make a plethora of colors, shades, and hues of gels with stages of intensity so a production can get any color they desire from a light that only makes a range of 1. Tungsten lights get a little warmer with color temperature as you dim them, but they're generally pretty limited in the colors they can provide. The only issue with gels is that you had to ensure that a production assistant was keeping an eye on them throughout the shoot to make sure that the heat of the tungsten lamps didn't melt them or make them catch fire. The only thing to catch fire about this production, thankfully, was the reception when audiences finally got to see it in theaters. The Descent was released for its first wide release in the UK on July 10th, 2005, with a wide release in the US directly following its Sundance Film Festival debut on January 26th, 2006. The film received wide acclaim in both UK and US markets, despite alternate endings, and was even on several top 10 lists. The US ending, in which the protagonist does in fact make it out of the cave, as opposed to the UK version, where after this moment she discovers she was hallucinating and never does make it back, was almost entirely to allow for a setup of a sequel, which received mixed reviews compared to the overwhelming positivity of the first installment. And for me personally, who isn't much of a horror buff, this was a surprisingly interesting film for me to watch. Not only was the acting and story engaging, but despite the tight budget, the production and character design was superb, and it really was enjoyable for me to dive into the nitty-gritty behind the scenes of the film. I like being able to dive deeper into the technical aspects of film production in a way that most behind-the-scenes documentaries and interviews rarely do, as even they are more focused on telling the story of the film from a marketing perspective, just to get butts in seats, as opposed to providing a learning experience about the production itself for those more interested in how the industry actually works. To put it metaphorically, it's like watching the men and women pull the strings behind the magic show, as opposed to just taking a peek behind the curtain after the fact. If you'd like to hear more of these behind-the-scenes stories and learn more about the technicalities of film, let me know in the comments. Now that Kurt has done me the massive, indescribable service of taking the editing off my hands, I finally have the needed time to address other areas of the business, both administrative and hopefully creative. And if one of those areas of interest is deep dives like this, I'd be more than happy to make it happen for you guys. It's a great opportunity for me to learn, and it's a great excuse for me to rewatch some of my favorite films. Thank you for watching this, and I'm gonna kick it back to Mattis to wrap up the rest of the episode. But hope you liked, and hit that subscribe button.
I'm going to be honest, I don't know what he just said. I did not have a chance to read his section of the script before we filmed, but I'm assuming it was good. I'm hoping you guys liked it. He's considering starting a channel to talk about film stuff. Wouldn't be as frequent as this one, but would be an interesting one. As you've probably picked up, this video was made during a short week when I didn't have time to write a full script. That's why it is unfortunately a little bit less organized, a little bit more stream of consciousness. I hope that that is okay and that you enjoyed it, especially because October is a weird month for us every year. You know, we want to do more Halloween stuff. We don't know how best to do it. I'm hoping that this kind of weaving movies and folklore and disappearances together is doing it for you, is what I'm trying to say. And if it is doing it for you, then you can help us out, you can support us, you can help us to not care so much about what is being promoted or deranked by checking us out on Patreon, where you can get access to ad-free versions of these videos, as well as the scripts from those videos as I am able to edit them and get them out for publication. And on top of that, it is just $1. It's $1 a month. There are higher tiers, and we appreciate it, but if all of you who watch this video did $1 a month, we could just do that forever. We could just make videos on whatever it is you guys wanted, and that would be really cool. As it stands right now, however, we are working very hard on this channel, as well as several others. We have the Weird Bible, which will be getting new content soon. I am currently in the process of filming a new show called My Apologies for it. We just want to get a backlog of those together. We also have History Unhinged, which we shoot with Stephen Bell of Sakuya and History of Everything. We've got some new episodes of that lined up. Very excited to have Reed Choi as our first guest on the upcoming series. And then we've got a whole bunch of others, which will include Roanoke Gaming, coming up on the next shoot in February. There's also my personal channel, Aiden Mattis, where I mostly do gaming streams. I'm hoping to get back to commentary. I know I've been saying that for a year and a half now, but I'm a busy man. And if you need a nice beverage while you're luring your lodge on a Friday afternoon, you can get it from Tableau Roasting Company with Mount Pocono Perk, our signature coffee that I designed myself. It is both mild enough to drink with cream and sugar and not get a weird, overwhelming flavor, and it's complex enough to drink black and still enjoy it. It also makes a surprisingly decent espresso. Thinking about me every night. And if you really want to get in the spirit, you can get our merch from Bunker Branding. We should probably release some new stuff, but you can get our classic logos, our Redacted Media shirt, the Lift Lodge if you like to get swole. Try and see if Fabletics will make us a Lift Lodge shirt. So thank you to Fabletics for sponsoring the video, by the way. That was pretty cool of you guys. And I mentioned it earlier in the episode, we do have a live show that is every Monday night at 7 p.m., unless it's not. And if it's not, we'll tell you. Usually if it's not, it's because one of us has an important engagement or because the birds are on. Go birds. Last, but probably one of the more important things that I should be putting at the beginning of this segment, join us on Discord. It is bit.ly/jointhelodge, or you can head down to the link in the description to join from there. Thanks for watching the video. I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.